These Japanese female POW nurses were stunned when American soldiers didn't punish them, but offered to protect them instead. She had been trained her entire life that capture meant shame, followed by a brutal death. So when the enemy soldier approached, the young nurse closed her eyes, expecting a blow, but the strike never came. Instead, an American medic knelt before her. In his outstretched hand was not a weapon, but a small, clean bar of soap. He pointed to a canteen of fresh water. There were no chains, no shouting. They were led to a tent where food was waiting. This mercy was a shock she couldn't understand. But as she began to wash the grime from her hands, she overheard whispers from nearby civilians. Terrible stories, not of American cruelty, but of the atrocities committed by her own honorable Japanese army. The people she was taught were monsters, were treating her with dignity. And the soldiers she was sworn to serve were being called monsters themselves. When your enemy shows you a kindness that your own side has forgotten, who do you believe? We kindly invite you to share in the comments which city you are watching from and the time there. We are interested to know how far these accounts travel. If truth, mercy, and memory matter to you, subscribe to keep them alive. It was August of 1945, and the world had burned down to this one small field on the island of Luzon. The air was thick with the ghost smell of smoke and medicine from their torched hospital tent. Crouched behind a fallen tree, two-year-old nurse Yukiko kept her head down, her fingers tightly clutching a single, clean bandage roll. It was a useless reflex, a tiny piece of order in the chaos. Beside her, Lieutenant Nakamura, their senior nurse, was a statue of military posture, her face a mask of rigid calm that did not fool Yukiko for a second. The third nurse, a young girl named Hane, was silently weeping. They could hear the heavy boots of the American soldiers getting closer, crushing the dry grass. Every story, every training lecture, every whispered warning from their commanders had prepared them for this moment. They were told the enemy did not take prisoners, not female ones. They were told to expect cruelty, a final violence that would erase the shame of their capture. Surrender was not an option, survival was a disgrace. Yukiko's father had once told her that honor without mercy was brittle, but in the Emperor's army there was no room for such soft ideas. Now, the lessons of propaganda felt like a cold stone in her stomach. She prepared herself for the shouting, for a rifle butt, for the end. A pair of dusty brown boots stopped just in front of her. She flinched, her eyes squeezed shut, but the blow never landed. When she dared to look up, she saw not a monster, but a man. He was young, his face tired and smudged with dirt, and he was kneeling. The American soldier was kneeling on the ground, bringing himself down to her level. It was so unexpected it broke the spell of her fear. He held out his hand. Lying on his palm was a small greenish bar of soap. It was a simple thing, a GI. Soap bar. But in that moment, it felt like a message from another world. He said no words, simply gestured with his head toward a canteen hanging from his belt. Yukiko's gaze drifted from the soap to the man's sleeve, where she saw a patch with a red cross on it and the word medic. He wasn't even carrying a rifle. This man was a healer, just like her. He was the enemy, yet they shared the same duty. Lieutenant Nakamura watched with sharp, distrustful eyes. But she did not stop Yukiko as she slowly, hesitantly, reached out and took the soap. Its rough texture felt impossibly real in her trembling hand. The soldiers led them away, not in chains, but with a quiet, professional distance. They were not marched to a grim stockade, but to a large shaded tent set away from the main camp. Inside, the heat of the day was replaced by a cool stillness. On a small folding table sat 3 tin cups of water and a plate of crackers. It was the plainest of offerings, but to women who had been running for days, it was a banquet. A young American corporal approached them, not with a weapon, but with a clipboard. He pointed to it and then to them, and Yukiko understood. He wanted their names. He handed her a pencil. She wrote her own name, then her 2 companions, her hand moving with the familiar precision of filling out a medical chart. This small act of bureaucracy was the most human thing she had experienced in weeks. They were not just captured objects, they were individuals with names, being recorded on a list. It was a simple rule of war, a rule she'd been taught the Americans ignored. As they sat, quietly sipping their water, the sounds of the world outside the tent began to filter in. They could hear voices speaking Tagalog, the local language. Filipino civilians were talking to the American guards, their words drifting on the breeze. Yukiko, who had learned some of the language from local patients, began to understand. They were not talking about the Americans. They were telling stories of the Japanese occupation, horrifying stories. They spoke of villages burned, of families taken away in the night by the Kempietai, the secret police. They described soldiers from the Imperial Army, her army, the army she had been taught was honorable and disciplined, acting with a brutality she could not imagine. Each word she understood was a crack in the foundation of her world. The men she served, the cause she believed in, were being described as the monsters she had been taught to fear. She looked down at the bar of soap still clutched in her hand, then at her own dirty fingers. The stories she had just heard felt like a different kind of filth, a stain on her soul that no soap could ever wash away. The Americans had offered her water to clean her hands, while her own countrymen had left behind a legacy of blood and fear. A single disorienting question formed in her mind, a question that cut deeper than any wound. If we were the enemy, why are they washing us? The truth she had been raised on was beginning to crumble, and she was terrified of what might be left in its place. The rules had been written in dust and ink long before they were written on her heart. Yukiko remembered the training hall in 1944, the crisp officer repeating the imperial orders. He had promised them that nurses, if captured, would be treated as officers, a sign of the respect the enemy was required to show them. But then he showed them the posters. The images were monstrous and vivid, American soldiers depicted as savage beasts with sharp teeth and wild eyes, preying on the helpless. He told them, the Geneva Convention was just a piece of paper to the Allies, a myth they did not honor. He had made it clear that capture was a fate worse than death, a stain upon their family and their emperor. Now in the American camp, those same rules she was told were a lie were being followed with a quiet, undeniable sincerity. Every ration, every clean bandage, every polite nod was a direct contradiction to the terrifying images seared into her memory. The propaganda had been loud and colorful. This new reality was calm and plain, and far more powerful. In the weeks that followed, the nurses were given a purpose. The American medical staff, seeing their skill and discipline, asked them to help tend to the wounded Japanese prisoners of war. At first, the arrangement was stiff and silent. Lieutenant Nakamura oversaw their work with an unblinking gaze, her posture so rigid it seemed to defy the humid air. She insisted they follow Imperial Army sanitation protocols, a small act of defiance that the American medics, led by the quiet Sergeant Cole, seemed to respect. Yukiko found a strange rhythm in the shared work. She would clean a wound, and an American corpsman would hand her a fresh bandage. They spoke a common language of medicine that needed no translation. She watched Sergeant Cole, the same medic who had given her the soap, kneel by the cot of a feverish Japanese boy and speak to him in soft, reassuring tones the boy couldn't possibly understand, yet somehow did. They were no longer just captives. They were nurses again. One afternoon, the air in the medical tent was heavy with suffering. A young soldier was crying out in his sleep. Hane, the youngest nurse, began humming a simple lullaby from her village as she changed his dressing, a soft, repetitive melody that seemed to cut through the pain. A moment later, another sound joined hers. It was Sergeant Cole, sitting on an ammunition crate in the corner, playing the same tune on a small harmonica. The notes were clear and gentle. For a few minutes, the tent was transformed. It was not a prisoner of war facility. It was not a place of enemies. It was just a room where people were trying to heal, bound together by a simple song. In that moment, the war outside, with its flags and its hatred, felt very far away. By late September of 1945, the nurses were officially processed as prisoners under the authority of the U.S. Sixth Army. They were moved to a more established facility near Manila, and with this move came another impossible kindness: the chance to write letters home. An officer from the Red Cross explained that the letters would be delivered. Yukiko wrote to her mother, her hand shaking. She kept the message brief, telling her only that she was alive, safe, and being treated well. She sealed the thin paper with a mix of desperate hope and deep suspicion. It was a test. If this letter, this proof of life, reached her family, then the mercy they had been shown was real. Weeks crawled by. Then one day, a Red Cross worker handed her a reply. It was from her mother. The familiar handwriting, the simple words confirming she was praying for Yukiko's return, were proof. A promise had been kept. Yukiko held the letter to her chest and wept, not from sadness, but from the staggering relief of a trust confirmed. But just as this new hope began to take root, a darker reality intruded. Whispers and rumors began to circulate among the male POWs who were being prepared for repatriation. They spoke of what awaited them back in Japan. Not a hero's welcome, but a traitor's shame. They said that any soldier who survived capture would be seen as a coward who had failed to die for the emperor. The stories became more personal, more cruel. One of the other nurses received a message through a newly arrived prisoner. Her fiancé, a pilot killed over Okinawa, had left a final letter. In it, he wrote that if she were ever captured, she was to take her own life. To live as a prisoner, he said, would make her a coward unworthy of his memory. The words struck Yukiko like a physical blow. The kindness they had received here had allowed them to live, but what if living was the greatest dishonor of all? From the hills overlooking Manila Bay, she could see the great transport ships that would one day take them home. They were no longer symbols of freedom, they were ships of judgment. She looked at the American guards, at Sergeant Cole with his harmonica, and a cold doubt entered her heart. Was this all just a performance? Was their mercy simply a carefully staged play, designed to make them look good in the eyes of the world, while her own culture prepared to condemn her for surviving it? The spring of 1946 brought the scent of salt and cherry blossoms, but as the transport ship slid into Yokosuka harbor, all Yukiko could smell was the cold, damp steel of the deck. Home was supposed to be a feeling of release, of warmth. Instead, it was a gray shoreline under a gray sky. Wrapped in clean, coarse U.S. Army blankets, she and the other nurses walked down the gangplank onto the soil of a defeated Japan. There were no smiling faces, no families waving from the pier. There were only quiet, weary crowds who stared with a mixture of pity and suspicion, and uniformed officials from the new repatriation bureau who held clipboards like weapons. The faces in the crowd were not welcoming. They were judging. And in their hollow eyes, Yukiko saw her own reflection not as a survivor, but as a curiosity, a ghost who had failed to disappear. They were led into a cold, drafty warehouse where their names were called out one by one. The questions were not about their health or their ordeal. They were sharp, sterile inquiries about collaboration. Had they provided intelligence? Had they fraternized with the enemy? Had they forgotten their duty? The men asking the questions were Japanese, but their tone was as foreign as any American's. They spoke of honor, but their eyes held none. This was not a homecoming. It was an interrogation. Then came the demand to surrender all enemy goods. An official with a tired, impatient face stood before a wooden crate. One by one, the women gave up the small tokens they had kept, a tin of coffee, a chocolate bar. Yukiko reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, worn bar of GI soap. It was more than soap to her. It was the memory of a hand held out in mercy, the first crack in the wall of her fear. The official took it without a word and dropped it into the crate. It landed with a dull thud, a small green symbol of kindness, now officially labeled contraband. As the official sifted through her meager belongings, his fingers brushed against the small, cloth-bound diary she had kept hidden. For a terrifying second, their eyes met. In that moment, Yukiko knew that if he found it, he would burn it. This small book, filled with her own quiet thoughts and the truth of her experience, was more dangerous to them than any American weapon. It was her memory, unapproved and unedited. She held her breath, subtly shifting her weight to conceal it deeper in the folds of her clothing. The official's eyes moved on. He was only looking for things. He had no interest in thoughts. She had saved her story, but now she understood it was something she had to hide, a secret to be kept buried. The weeks that followed were filled with a profound and crushing silence. Her family took her in, but they treated her with a delicate, suffocating politeness. They did not ask about her time in the camp. Neighbors who once greeted her warmly now crossed the street to avoid her. Whispers followed her like a shadow. The enemy nurses, they called them, the women who had been touched by the Americans. Old comrades from nursing school, women whose husbands or brothers had died in the final, desperate battles, looked at her as if she were a betrayal in human form. The shame her fiancé's letter had warned of was no longer a distant threat. It was the air she breathed, the food she ate. It was in the averted eyes of her own mother. One night, alone in the small room she had been given, Yukiko carefully unwrapped her diary. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages, her own handwriting looking like that of a stranger. She stopped at an entry written in the Luzon camp, a few simple words scrawled in pencil. "I am alive." When she had written it, the sentence had been a declaration of victory, a small miracle. Now, in the suffocating silence of her homecoming, the words read like a confession of guilt. To be alive was to have failed. She closed the book, the weight of her survival pressing down on her. She remembered the sound of Sergeant Cole's harmonica, a melody that had bridged the gap between enemies, and woke to the sound of nothing at all. Her mercy had been real, but her shame felt truer. Then, a week later, a letter arrived. It was thin, with foreign stamps. With trembling fingers, she opened it. It was from a U.S. Red Cross worker she barely remembered. Tucked inside was a small black and white photograph. It was of her, Hane, and Lieutenant Nakamura in the medical tent, tending to a wounded Japanese soldier. They looked tired, but focused. They looked like nurses. On the back, written in careful English, were 4 words. "You saved lives," it read. It was not an order or a judgment. It was a fact. It was a different story, a different kind of honor, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a tiny, fragile spark of light in the darkness. The small photograph and its 4 simple words became a quiet anchor in the silent sea of her life. For 2 years, Yukiko moved through a world that refused to see her. She found simple work, teaching hygiene to young children, her skills as a nurse reduced to showing them how to properly wash their hands. She did not speak of the war. She did not speak of the camp. Her diary remained hidden, a secret history tucked away in a camphorwood chest. The silence was a form of survival, a way to avoid the judgment in her own family's eyes. She was a ghost in her own home, and the memory of dignity she had felt in the American medical tent seemed like a distant dream. Then, in 1948, a formal letter arrived. It was from a historian at a Tokyo university who was part of a committee documenting the experiences of Japanese prisoners of war. He was requesting her testimony. Her name, he explained, had appeared in American military records. Her first impulse was to burn the letter. To speak would be to invite the shame back in, to give it a voice. The whispers in the street had faded, replaced by the weary work of rebuilding the nation. Why would she tear open a wound that had just begun to scar over? To talk about the kindness of the enemy felt like a betrayal of the suffering of her own people. It was safer to be forgotten. For days, she left the letter unanswered. But the request had unsettled the quiet surface of her life. At night, she would take out the photograph of herself in the medical tent. She looked at the focused expression on her younger self's face, the professional way her hands were wrapping a bandage. That person was not a traitor. She was a nurse, doing her duty. She remembered the lullaby, the harmonica, and the quiet respect in Sergeant Cole's eyes. Finally, she took out her diary. She ran her fingers over the worn cloth cover, then opened it to the first page, the one written in the terror and confusion of that first day in the field on Luzon. She read the words she had written about the kneeling medic and the bar of soap. They were simple, honest words, a record of a moment that had changed everything. Holding the historian's letter in one hand and her diary in the other, she made a decision. Her silence had protected her from shame, but it had also hidden the truth. She wrote back to the historian and agreed to meet him. He was a kind, serious man with gentle eyes who met her not in a formal office, but in a quiet tea room. He did not interrogate her. He simply asked her to tell him what had happened. Yukiko found that her voice, so long used for quiet pleasantries, trembled as she began. But then she opened her diary. She did not summarize or explain. She simply read. She read the entry about the first day, her voice growing steady as she gave sound to the memory. He knelt, she read. He was the enemy, but he knelt first. He did not hold a rifle. He held a bar of soap. She read about the crackers and the water, and the clipboard with their names. When she was finished, a long silence filled the room. The historian did not look at her with pity, but with a deep, scholarly respect. He then opened his own file. "Your testimony is important," he said softly. "It aligns with a report we found in the American archives." He slid a translated document across the table. It was a formal recommendation written by a U.S. Army medic named Daniel Cole. In it, Sergeant Cole had recommended Nurse Yukiko for a commendation for her humane and professional conduct while treating wounded soldiers, both Japanese and Allied, in the Luzon Field Hospital. The shame that had clung to her for years, the heavy cloak of dishonor she had worn since her return, simply fell away. Her survival had not been a failure. Her service, the very acts for which she felt such guilt, had been seen, recorded, and honored by the very enemy she was taught to fear. Her honor had never been lost. It had just been waiting in a quiet file halfway around the world for her to find it. In the years that followed, Yukiko found her voice again. She began to teach, not just hygiene to children, but wartime nursing ethics to young students. She wanted them to understand that duty and compassion were not enemies, but two sides of the same honorable coin. In her first lecture, she did not put up a slide of a medical diagram or a military regulation. She showed her students the small, faded photograph of 3 Japanese nurses tending to their countrymen in an American tent. "Honor without cruelty" became her motto, a tribute to her father's words and a lesson learned in a dusty field. Her diary, once a hidden secret, was eventually placed in a small museum dedicated to the post-war experience. It lay open under glass, a testament to a quiet truth. One evening, before giving it away, she had turned to the last blank page and wrote a new final line, a message to herself and to anyone who would ever read her story. "Mercy," she wrote, "is a rule worth keeping."